Good evening. Welcome. Thanks everyone for being here. Can you all hear me okay? Is the volume okay? Great, thank you. Thank you for nodding. That's helpful. Welcome, I'm Alyssa. I'm Labyrinth's events coordinator, and I have the honor of introducing tonight's guests, Elizabeth Margulis and Tania Lombrozo. First, a few logistics. Lisa's new book, Transported, is available for sale. You'll find copies on the table behind you by the stairs. Also on that table is a sign-up sheet for our events newsletter. If you don't already receive our newsletter, you may sign up there for once weekly updates on Labyrinth events in store and around town. Lisa and Tania's conversation will be followed by a question and answer period. I will run a mic to the audience. Please raise your hand really high so I can see you, and I'll bring you a microphone. That way everyone can hear your question. After the event, Lisa will sign books at this table over here. You may pick up a book from the table by the stairs, bring it to the signing table to get signed, and then pay for it upstairs at the cash register on your way out. There's no need for you to run up and down the stairs before you have your book signed. Tonight's event will end with a catered reception provided by Princeton University's Department of Music. I hope you'll all join us during this book signing to enjoy some light refreshments as we celebrate Lisa's book. Thank you to our co-sponsors, Princeton University's Department of Music, Humanities Council, and the Princeton Symphony Orchestra for their support. This coalition is why this room is so full, so I'm so appreciative to them and to all of you for being here. Please take a moment this evening to visit the orchestra's table behind you to learn about their upcoming Princeton Festival. Elizabeth Margulis is a researcher in music cognition and a trained classical pianist. She is professor and acting chair of the Department of Music at Princeton University, where she directs the Music Cognition Lab. She is also the author of the Oxford Very Short Introduction to the Psychology of Music. Tania Lombrozo is professor of psychology at Princeton, where she directs the program in cognitive science. Her research aims to address foundational questions about cognition using the tools of cognitive psychology and analytic philosophy. Her book, Why We Ask Why, The Science of Explanation and the Human Drive to Understand, will be released in October. Lisa Margulis' book, Transported, The Everyday Magic of Musical Daydreams, explores something I'm certain that everyone in this room has experienced, though I anticipate we've never spoken about it to others: hearing a song and being unexpectedly tugged into a long-forgotten memory or the imaginings of a daydream. In these moments, we find ourselves revisiting events from our pasts or ruminating on scenarios we've never experienced. There is much to learn from Transported about our mind's capacity for narrative, both real and fantasized, and about the close relationship between remembering and imagining events. Not only are our brains wired for storytelling, Lisa shows, but as we listen to pieces of music, our minds are apt to conjure memories or stories that are similar to those the music triggers in others. Music has the power to collectively guide our thoughts into subjects that are shared across our communities. The revelations in this book are born out of Lisa's extensive research on data across the disciplines of psychology, neuroscience, and ethnography, and Lisa's findings enrich how we think about interconnectedness, collective consciousness, the power of community, especially the ways in which we find commonalities across cultures and across generations. Transported is a truly remarkable book, and I'm so glad that we have Lisa and Tania here to help us go through this subject. Please now join me in welcoming Elizabeth Margulis and Tania Lombrozo.
Hello. Thank you, everybody, for joining us in celebrating Lisa's phenomenal new book, and I'm so excited to get to discuss it here with her today. One of the things that I love about the book is that it takes an everyday experience that is incredibly familiar to all of us, and it gives us all of these new ways to understand it and appreciate it and learn from it. And so to start us off, Lisa, I'd love to hear from you about your journey into this phenomenon. What led you to study this scientifically and to write a book about it?
So I first want to just thank everybody for being here. There are so many people in this room who were so important to the development of this book, to ideas in the book, to work that's covered in the book, to Tania has been my book buddy through this entire process from the very beginning. We've been kind of on the same schedule, and I'm just very grateful to all of you. Basically, in the book, I'm really trying to take readers on a journey that I went on myself as a recovering conservatory-trained pianist. So I think I had really forgotten about this aspect of music listening, and it was really only when I was having really deep, extended conversations with students and they were surprising me with the incredibly vivid, concrete imaginings they were experiencing while they were listening to music, that I became convinced this was a real phenomenon, and it was interesting, and it was neglected. And so all those things kind of came together to set me down the trajectory of trying to figure out what was going on here.
And in the course of starting to study musical daydreams scientifically and writing the book, did that change your own experience of music or your own musical daydreams?
Yes, and mostly because one of the big lessons for me from the book is, or from the research that led to the book, is that although talking about your dreams, have you ever gone into a conversation and somebody is like, I had the weirdest dream last night, and you immediately know you can check out for the next 5 minutes? It's like so boring. What's really amazing about musical daydreams is because there's a shared prompt in the world, there's actually something to talk about. What I've found having these conversations across generations with my parents, with my own children, is that much of the time, something comes to mind that is so surprising that comes to both of your minds. And that's already really interesting and fun. But some of the times, the experience is really divergent, and it's really an opportunity to get behind someone else's ears and kind of imaginatively inhabit how they're experiencing the world. And it's helped me get to know my own kids better over the course of long road trips to Maine in the summer.
I want to read a line from the book that I love that actually relates to something that you just said. So you write that musical daydreams weld together the outer perceptual world and the inner imagined one. And that's, I think, a theme we see in lots of ways throughout the book, that there's a way in which musical daydreams inhabit this kind of special place psychologically. And I was hoping you could say a little bit more about that special place. What's special about musical daydreams and what they tell us about the human mind?
Yeah, so what I'm really intrigued about here is the way that characteristics that we normally attribute to perception. So we can agree on, that the presence of that, what is that called? Podium. We can agree. We may not agree on the name. We can agree on the presence of the podium, right? But we tend to think that our kind of more spontaneous thoughts are kind of hopelessly idiosyncratic and personal and subjective. And what I discovered across the course of much of this research is that actually what comes most readily to our mind really has very obvious, clear roots in our perceptual environment. And that means that the world we're building together, what we're making of our environment around us, is shaping what we're capable of thinking and imagining, and that is a powerful concept. So I look at music as a window into this broader phenomenon rather than a case that is so specially removed from other stimuli.
Could you tell us about the example of pirates to illustrate this?
Sure. This is kind of embarrassing because it's actually a failed pedagogical experiment. So I know there are many people that I've had in my class here, and I hope that I've had more success in my interactions with you. This was a class on the psychology of music that I taught in a 3-hour afternoon slot in a basement, much like this one, but fewer books, with no windows. And it was our first class meeting, and the goal of this classroom exercise was to show everybody how subjective and variable musical experiences are, and really get them thinking about how tough it was going to be to do anything scientific about a topic like this, right? I just wanted to set up that problem from day one. So I had this idea that I would play them a piece of music they were unlikely to have heard before, and just ask them to describe what they thought about while they were listening. And the whole point of this exercise is that one person would say they were hungry for a ham sandwich, and the other would say the flute sounded good, and it would just, really have so much variety. And instead, the first student raised their hand and said, "Well, I pictured pirates." And then a second student said, yeah. And it was like a big storm, and and they were like, someone said battening down the hatches, and it just, and I was like, wow, this was such a bad idea. They're all influencing each other. They're like, So I waited an entire year, taught the class again, and I thought I was really conniving and brilliant. I was like, I will hand out little slips of paper, and they will write it down and hand it back, right? So same thing, but this time they're not saying it out loud. So I got a little stack of folded papers, and then I unfolded them one by one, and they said pirates. So that was really the seed of really all of this, anyways.
Maybe this is part of the answer already, but could you tell us what you found most surprising as a scientist in the course of this research and writing the book?
Yeah, I mean, for me, the most just active moment of surprise was, I'd had these informal observations with students in classes, like it seemed like these commonalities were real, but then there's the thing where we ran it in person, one at a time, with people coming in to a sound attenuated booth, right? And then you come out the other end and you have all of these free response descriptions. On the one hand, at the time, this seemed like a terrible idea, right? Like free response descriptions of what people imagine while they listen to music. I realized the pirate phenomenon happened. Maybe that was something eccentric about that particular excerpt or the students, or I don't know. So it was really when I was, after this whole, we'd collected all our data, and I was sitting here at a computer, looking at this file, and just seeing in one file just the same words, like tiny creatures frolicking was a big thing in one of them. Another one was 1920s city street, a man intrigued by the woman walking ahead of him. Just very, very concrete, and watching this show up again and again in these individual responses that had been collected one at a time was really so striking to me that actually the first thing I did was call up my colleague Devin McCauley, who some of you know at Michigan State, and Natalie Phillips, because Devin studies psychology of music and Natalie studies psychology of fiction, and I thought maybe together they would understand something that would help illuminate what was going on here. And they just said the students are influencing each other. It's like they're talking about the experiment outside the hall, like, please send us the files. And so I sent them, and they reran everything in East Lansing, and then a couple weeks later they called and they were like, the tiny creatures are frolicking in Michigan as well.
So far you've been emphasizing the surprising similarity in people's musical daydreams in response to the same kinds of musical experiences. And that's one of the major themes in the book. And another major theme is the fact that you can get a lot of cross-cultural variability in musical daydreams. So I was hoping you could tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so we were also fortunate to have a grant from the National Science Foundation that allowed us to take this same study and bring it to a rural community in China where people speak Dong, have very different exposure to media, so do not have exposure to Western media ordinarily. And we ran the same study there. And what we saw is that the same thing occurred, and that it was immediately easy for people to say what story had come to mind, number one. And number two, that the story that they imagined was the same overall for individual excerpts, right? But that's just within the village. So if you look between the cultures, they were different to a really startling degree. Let me give you my favorite example of an excerpt that the US participants heard as someone alone in a house getting stalked by a murderer. And the participants in D-Men experienced it as having fun outside playing games with friends. And that's an example where you could stretch your imagination if you were a stalking murderer hearer and think, okay, wait, if I were not just really kind of blinded by the fact that this is an atonal excerpt, say, and I didn't care about that, And I tuned in instead to the fact that these notes are really short, they're jumping back and forth really quickly between high and low registers. You can start to see how that could sound playful. And so that's what I mean by how interesting it can be to kind of imaginatively extend yourself to how someone else is hearing music at that level of cross-culturally or generationally, or just like micro cultural differences between yourself and people you're talking to.
So I asked you what was most surprising as a scientist about this process, and I'm curious what was most surprising to you as a musician. Was there something about the research itself or the process of writing the book that really surprised you in your role as a musician?
Yeah, I really want to address this because I've spoken about this research a lot with people in classical music contexts, like at conservatories and so forth. And even we ran a study in coordination with Princeton University concerts run by Hannah Wilkie, who's here, a grad student in the lab. And there were a lot of people who had quite a bit of training in this tradition. And one of the things that training can do is really valorize attentive listening, right? Like you should not, like your mind wandering is bad, it's bad. And we saw that in some of the responses we collected at the concert. And we see that sometimes when I go talk to people who's, they're spending hours a day, like crafting the micro timing, of how they're playing something. And I can tell them, I'm like, I love what you're doing. And also when you play that, the first thing that's gonna come to people's mind is a cartoon cat chasing a cartoon mouse. And like that is depressing at first. And so what it ends up being is this exercise in a communicative, like crossing a communicative gap, right? There's a lot more going on than what initially comes to mind for an audience member. But I do think as a performer, being kind of literate about these affordances that really are constraining how people are going to hear what you're doing is important to ultimately, achieving even the very subtle things that you're trying to do as an artist.
So I have a question, which is a study that I don't know if you've run. Suppose you were to take one of your studies where you have people report their musical daydreams, but your participants were students in a musical conservatory or, musicians of various kinds. What would you expect?
Yeah, we've done that a little bit in that we're able to separate out people who have training in our studies from people who don't have a lot of training. And, but my guess if we did that like dead on is that the more training you have, the less you would do this. And I think that's part of my own journey here was coming from not understanding this way of listening to getting curious about it to actually finding real value and interest in it.
Yeah, how much do we know about what's actually going on in terms of cognitive mechanisms, brain mechanisms, as people experience these musical daydreams?
Yeah, here's what we've been doing to try to figure out what's going on. We've been using the same excerpts and asking people to tell us what they imagine or asking people to tell us what they remember. And then comparing what's in the memory and what's in the imagining. We've been also asking people to do things in real time. So as a longer excerpt progresses, tell us at time points as it's ongoing what they're imagining. We've also, one possibility is that the music conjures up some concept, like it seems like war music, or it conjures up an emotion, like it seems aggressive, let's say. And then what happens is you just fill that in with some conventional story that's associated with war or with aggression, right? That's one possible mechanism. And so what we did to investigate that was actually just have people come in and say, war. Okay, now what do you imagine, right? And if they tell us the same things that they tell us with the excerpt of music, it's clear the music isn't actually doing that much, except for maybe activating the concept, right? But that's not what we see. number one. And then number two, because we see this ongoing agreement across longer excerpts about when people are experiencing some part of their story, we see that it's really tightly locked, actually, with what's happening in the music, rather than it's just that you get a concept and then you zone out. And I want to shout out Tiffany Ralston, who did a great undergraduate thesis on that topic.
Do you have a sense of what range of sensory experiences are involved in these daydreams? So as I was reading the book and thinking about my own musical daydreams, it was very saliently visual. But that's just one of our senses. You could have other kinds of auditory experiences that accompany the auditory experience of the music. Maybe you have olfactory imagery. Maybe you sort of think about particular kinds of sensations. What's known? What do we know about the sort of like the range of imagery involved across sensory modalities?
One thing is that when you pit music as a cue against other types of cues, like food, maybe it's a Proustian idea that you like have the Madeleine and you remember something, or famous faces or other kinds of cues, that the sensory detail of the memory that music cues tends to be greater. So you might remember more facts when you have another cue for a memory, and more, reliving kinds of, like, you remember, where your body was in space and what you felt and like how it really was. So there's something that's quite immersive and vivid.
I'm curious what you think. It seems like a lot of what the book does is identify ways in which musical daydreams uncover these sort of like seams in the research literature, these places that people hadn't really appreciated that there might be interesting interplays. And I'm curious if you could pick out sort of what you think was the biggest gap or the biggest misunderstanding about the mind that you think taking the phenomenon of musical daydreams seriously helps illuminate for us.
Yes. So there was another book in my field that was written for general audiences that came out exactly 20 years ago called This Is Your Brain on Music. Did anyone read that book? And that book did an amazing job of communicating to sort of just, it's now kind of in the water, like people get that you can think about music as a product of the mind, right? And that there's this like relationship there that's interesting that you can study. But I think the piece here that gets confusing is like, then you add in, yes, music's ubiquitous. Every known culture has something we might want to call music. But there's also so much variability and so much interesting kind of clear, cultural kind of factors at play. And so what I love about musical daydreams is they resist being adequately characterized by a framework that only looks at culture, or by a framework that only looks inside one mind, like as some reified biological phenomenon. You really have to look at the ways that the interplay between environment and society and culture and exposure, is scaffolding and shaping what we think about as cognitive or mental. And so I just find that a really useful topic for kind of moving that paradigm forward.
Yeah, one of the things that you point out in the book that I think is really fascinating is that there's a lot of internal experience that we can't really share with another person. But one thing that's interesting about musical daydreams is we not only have the common feature in the environment that we're mutually experiencing in the music, but also it seems like musical daydreams really lend themselves to being described linguistically. And I was hoping we could talk a little bit about that, the sort of like special role of the fact that they're very deeply personal, but at the same time also something that can be interpersonal and communal.
Yes, I actually find that really intriguing because those of you who are music scholars in the room, there's this whole discourse around music being ineffable, right? Or that like writing about music is like dancing about architecture, that whole kind of idea, right? And there's something there, right? There's something there. I get it. On the other hand, there's a degree to which we've kind of like suppressed or submerged some very real associative like concrete affordances that music has. Like I could play you any sound. I should have brought a sound. I could play you like any song right now. And you would have such robust intuitions about, even if you've never heard it before, who made it, why they made it, where they made it, like what kind of group they're a part of, where you would likely encounter it, right? And all those things are really, really significant part of even any kind of inchoate aspect that you subsequently have of that sound that we kind of seem to have collectively forgotten, or like we kind of pretend they're not there.
All right, I want to leave time for questions from the audience, but I have a final question for you. I'm curious if you want readers to take away sort of one new way of thinking about the human mind, or one new way of thinking about music, or both, what's that sort of key idea that you really are hoping readers get from the book?
Yeah, so we all know that as we're moving through the world, we're tracking all kinds of associations, right, that we don't know that we're tracking. And one of the things that's really cool about music is it really surfaces these in surprising ways, so that you can listen to something new and immediately, like I'll give you an example. There's an excerpt that we played people, and really just uniformly people said that's a cowboy sitting on a front stoop looking over a ghost town, optionally tumbleweed. And it's unclear. It really is unclear. Like even when you're a pretty sophisticated media theorist, like about music, you've studied musical. Some of these are very hard to pin down and figure out the like exact source of. Yet there's such agreement. Like it's clear that there's robust patterning that has given rise to this. So for me, one of the things these experiences do is sort of show you something about who you are, right? Like what the limits are of what comes to your mind when your mind drifts. Like this is the landscape that your mind is working on, right? And now obviously we have agency and can like think about other things. We don't have to mull over the cowboy all day. We don't want to. But these contours of what come to mind really readily reflect something about the kinds of experiences we've had that are illuminating, not only about us personally, but in terms of then how we communicate with others about their experiences and where they've been that got them to what popped into their minds.
I love that. So it's almost understanding how music is a reflection of our own experience and a sort of guide to our own imagination in a lot of ways.
Yeah, so I really encourage you to go home after this and try not to pay attention when you hear something. Like it's okay to sometimes pay attention, but just also respect these moments of inattention that you have with music.
Amazing. So I'm anticipating we're going to have a lot of questions for Lisa from the audience, and I believe that there is a microphone that is circulating. So we have 2 questions here in the front.
It sounds very, very interesting. I can't wait to read the book. I have a question regarding the following. If you had a chance in your research to compare, for example, the reactions for the daydreaming with atonal versus tonal music, or another area is, for example, what's called absolute music, which is meant to be just an abstract representation of art, and everybody might feel it differently, and program music, which is supposed to represent a specific kind of a scene. Do you have a chance to do any of that? Yes,
people don't care if it's absolute music or program music. They hear it as program music.
They hear it as program music?
Mm-hmm.
Either way, okay.
Yeah.
Hi, this is really interesting, so thank you. So I'm Matthew, and I play the piano as well. And so I was really intrigued because when you said about how sometimes we're not encouraged to think about our musical daydreams like as we play, I was wondering, like, since you're a pianist as well, do you believe after doing this research that pianists should now try to kind of infuse their playing with the musical daydreams they have?
So, right. I think that being alert to this dimension of engagement, right? I mean, there are many things, like, this is not a prescriptive exercise. There are so many ways to listen to music that can be, rich and meaningful. But I do think that performers should know how common of a response this is, and that, thinking about that and maybe playing with it as part of what you're doing in your performance could be interesting.
Lisa, I'm so excited to read your brilliant book. Thank you. I was wondering if you had any songs or pieces that you kept coming back to in your imagination while writing this.
Really, for me, during this whole process, it was car rides with my son, Alexander, who is here and is a really avid musical listener, and to music that I've never heard of before, I don't know anything about. And so, not only does Alex love to curate songs, but he's very thoughtful and reflective and good at talking about his experience of them. And so that was honestly what I was thinking about the most, because it was my most day-to-day kind of experience with stretching my musical imagination.
Hi, Lisa. Fascinating conversation. I'm struck by the experiment you did in the U.S. and China, and how you had very different but shared experiences in both places. It seems to call to mind the role of culture somehow in transfusing our imaginations and thoughts. And I'm curious if you've tugged at that and what you've thought. I initially thought maybe it's the music itself that carries that, but if these are pieces that are not composed in that culture, they've never heard before, or you haven't heard your son's music, it can't be traveling just through the music. It's got to be something else that's shared amongst the community. So curious.
Yeah, that's a great observation, because I should say that we see this even when we play people music from just styles that they're unfamiliar with, right? It's not like you have to have heard something similar precisely for this to work. I just forgot.
So what do you have any thoughts on what it is about shared culture that might be transmitting something that we're all sort of commonly experiencing there?
Yes. So basically, one of the things that I think is happening here is that it's sort of picking up these shards of things we've encountered that then get forced into something similar. So the cowboy example, just to start from, was actually an example of Chinese art music, where the way the instrument was played could read as dobro-like. Does that make sense? So there is this sort of way that sort of whatever framework you have kind of envelops whatever comes in.
I'm struck by feminist philosophy as this concept of a cultural imaginary that shapes what people can think of themselves, and is really important to sort of thinking about. It seems like a similar concept maybe going on here. So it's very fascinating.
Yeah, I think so, right. And I think that's important to keep in mind, that when we think our mind is roaming in this unfettered way, that it's been structured in all of these ways by the kinds of things we've encountered and the ideas and associations that make up our world. So to the extent that we bring that into our models of things that we treat now as inside one mind, that seems like a good idea.
Hi. Is there a playlist for those of us who want to hear the tumbleweeds and the pirates?
Yes. So there's a couple of places where you can find examples. One is Tania and I did together TEDx New England talks in Boston, and you can find those on the internet, and those have sound files. I also made a playlist for People magazine, but it doesn't have the tumbleweeds. But I can get you the tumbleweeds.
Hi, thank you for your talk. I was wondering if you did any research, or if you are considering any research regarding mental health in music, and how it contains sometimes ways to express oneself, or sometimes ways to help influence your emotions. Everyone knows when we're sad, we like to listen to sad songs. But I was wondering about that, because I also know that during different therapies, people listen to music while either they're on a treatment or doing something, and it can lead to very vivid hallucinations. So I was just wondering if there was any correlation or interest in that.
Yeah, great question. Absolutely. So most directly, perhaps, is just this idea that if you can jumpstart some thoughtscape as easily as pressing play on something, that's pretty powerful, right? Because there are lots of kinds of mental health situations where you've got stuck thoughts, and it's very hard to get out of the mindset that you're in. And like you mentioned, people intuitively use music for mood regulation. So it's very clear that that is happening. But I should also say there's a practice with a really long and interesting history that I talk about late in the book of using music to guide imagery as part of a specific clinical music therapy practice that is just has a completely fascinating history that I discuss in the book.
Hey, how's it going? I'm. What's up? I'm Alex. It's a pleasure to meet you, and it's been a fascinating talk. I'm wondering about the difference between autobiographical daydreams and fictional daydreams in the context of music, and what we know about what might spur either mode of imagining, and how they differ.
Yeah, great question. So we do, Alex, we do know that people tend to have more autobiographical memories for songs that are specifically familiar to them, right? And more fictional imaginings for songs that maybe they haven't exactly heard before. So maybe that's just an initial thing to say, but they're also somewhat malleable. In fact, I start the book with the example from the final scene from La La Land, which is a giant prolonged musical daydream. If you haven't seen that movie in a while, you can go back and rediscover this. And it starts out with Emma Stone's character remembering the beginning of their relationship, but then it continues with her fantasizing about something that didn't happen at all. Like they went on great and they lived happily ever after. So they can be intermingled in really intriguing ways too.
Thanks so much, Lisa. This is an amazing book. So one of the things I just want to hear a little bit more about is, sort of under what conditions we're more likely to have these musical daydreams. And, I've been thinking about the fact that I've been running while listening to music since I was about 14. And it's where I observe myself to daydream in the most elaborate and also relaxing ways. And I've always assumed it was something about the running and not the music. And now I'm sort of wondering, in fact, it's much more about the music. So that's what I was curious to hear more about.
Have you tried running without music?
I don't get very far.
Yeah, I think about this sometimes too, because sometimes if I go to a place where there's music that's, I think, intended to get me in this mindset, the fact that I feel like I'm being pressured to do that has the opposite effect. So yeah, I think the mood situation, right, is probably somewhat personal and, significant.
There we go. Okay. So I'm wondering if among your subjects you found that there were individuals who either didn't daydream no matter what music was played, or individuals who had the same daydream, who were fixated on.
Yes.
And one can only imagine what that might be. But when some, no matter what the music was, they sort of thought the same thoughts.
Yeah. That's a great question. Yes, there are absolutely non-musical daydreamers. One example would be people with aphantasia who lack this mind's eye, and there's been interesting work about their responses to music, because you can maybe ask some questions about how important these experiences are for musical enjoyment and emotional response and something if you find people who can't produce this kind of imagery and look at how it works there. But yeah, even in our studies, when somebody hadn't self-identified as aphantasic or anything like that, some of them just click no on everything. But it's hard to say if that's because they really didn't, or if they just wanted to leave and they were busy, or
Thanks so much, Lisa. But back here, congratulations on the book. It's super exciting. Your comment about music studies and where the music studies people are stuck, it really just started provoking a whole series of thoughts. And I'm...
In case you don't know, Wendy's in music studies.
Exactly. Happy to have Lisa as a treasured colleague. But it's so fun to get out of the university and to think about these issues in this big way. And what I'm thinking about is sort of how this resistance to this idea is set up, how it's been set up at different moments in the history of music, in the history of our discipline. And so sort of the two sides to my thought about this. One is how we can leverage this thinking to make music studies better. I mean, your point about, if you're playing the piano and thinking about this, but how can we leverage it is sort of one of the questions. And then the other would be sort of, if we think historically, because that's kind of how I'm wired, I think there are moments in the past where societies were more open to it, and then things came and got sort of shut down in different ways. And I'm just wondering how, either from an analytical point of view or historical point of view, we can run with so much of what you're doing that I'm just like, my brain is just fantasizing about that.
That's such a fun question. Yes, and in fact, I excavated across the course of doing the work for this book, a couple of like weird false starts like that, where people start, like there are a couple of cases where someone like publishes a confession. Like they're like, guys, I do this. And and I think if someone really, focused on it from a historical framework, I think there's a lot to say there that's really interesting. Yeah.
Hi, fellow Princeton mom here. Just curious, have you studied how music choice based on desired output, like for output of sports, or how we choose to listen to different music when we're working versus studying versus playing a sport, how that can change what we think will be a musical daydream or equals output, right? Success versus failure.
Yeah. So the first place I looked when I was trying to understand these taxonomies, like what kinds of stories came to people's mind, were production libraries for film music. So I thought maybe the stories we were getting would like match the categories in the production music libraries. That turned out not to be true. But I'm increasingly seeing that maybe we're in like a post-production library era, and it's like Spotify purpose-driven curation, right? Like playlist for relaxation, playlist for getting ready for the party with your friends, playlist for, and maybe that's driving a lot in ways that I have not yet updated my sense of how music's circulating. Yeah, I think that's probably true.
Hi, I'm curious if like different types of people like different types of music, in part because of what you're describing, right? So like some of us here, if you were like, oh, being alone in a cabin, for some of us it would be a nightmare, and others it would be like a dream, like something we would love. And I'm curious if that's at all associated with the kinds of music that we like.
Yeah, so I really think that so when I first started publishing on this, reviewers really wanted to say that this was downstream of emotional response. Like you had emotional response and then you concocted a story that went with that. And the more I work on this, the more I have this hunch that the other way around is at least as important, that sort of what is coming to mind in this scenario that, wherever it takes you, is an important part of your emotional response and, the music that you end up being drawn to. So I actually, though, hadn't thought about it in such a concrete way as you just formulated it, and that gives me a great idea for a Seamus study.
Hi, Lisa, here. So back in the day, a long time ago, when I used to do the Helen Bonny guided imagery work,
yes,
we tried really hard to avoid music with words, especially words in your native language, so because it manipulated the mind. So I'm wondering if any of your research stuck with non-word music, or how you've worked with that.
Yes, great question. So Kara Turnbull is here, who did her PhD basically on this, where she played people songs with the lyrics and had them describe memories, and found that there were striking similarities in the memories people freely described for individual songs. And Kara's first thought was, I actually talk about this work in the book. Kara's first thought was, oh, well, maybe the lyrics are just driving this and that's not interesting. And so she ran a bunch of other studies where she, instead of just giving people the lyrics, because then we thought that then maybe they would like imagine the song anyway, we gave people summaries of the lyrics, like a little short story that summarized what happened in the song and asked them to, provide the memory. And that did not produce the same effect. So it was really something in the music. And then I would also say in Hannah's project at the concert, we had, planned this so carefully. It's like so hard to collect data in a live event. And then completely with no forewarning, one of the composer and performers, Stephen Huff, came out and impromptu gave the entire audience a talk about what exactly he was imagining when he wrote his thing. We're like, But then Hannah had this brilliant idea to then actually use these same machine learning techniques to then measure how similar people's imaginings were to the content of what he had described. And found that there was more similarity between people's imaginings over and above what was just like in the prompt that he'd given. So that's sort of more evidence that there really is more beyond that going on.
So just one quick follow-up. The other way that we saw music was that it was a container for the people that were traveling, that were having the client. And so it was always music that had a beginning, middle, and end. Have you done any work with either ambient music or now they have sound baths, singing bowls or humming, more sound things that are kind of out of the range of that container?
Right, because part of it also is just everything's so overstimulating all the time that it's just, if you just have like one sensory modality, like it's just sound, now there's like space to actually think and imagine. So that's itself playing a role. Yes, there's we did one study, or maybe two, where we used 17 different genres, and one of them was ambient. And I can't remember what we found about ambient music. I'm sorry, but it's out there in the world, but I'm sorry.
Hi, I love this discussion. I love every single thought that's happening. Thank you for writing this story. I'm having lots of thoughts. So I'm a creative writer, and so when I am listening to the discussion, I also teach creative writing, and I use music a lot as a prompt for my students and for myself. And it is really interesting, and I have found what you are talking about, I see when you bring something, you get moods a lot of the time. So you get imagery if you get 20 people together, you play one and then a piece of music, and then you ask them to write a piece. You do get a mood, but you do sometimes get different images, and I find that super fascinating. But I'm also curious, because I look at it from using music in the creation of another art. Did you study the daydream in the creation of the music?
So maybe this connects a little bit your question and your question. So we can find excerpts that somebody wrote in like 1843 that, have a very clear program, like it's written out. So, we have some idea of at least what, the idea was, and maybe what people then would have like collectively imagined. Play that for people now, get a completely robust, stable, shared response that has zero to do with, whatever was in the program. So I think it's because, we're seeing these just emergent, shared, vocabularies contingent on patterns of exposure. It's like a dynamic thing that's changing over time. And so I just think that's an interesting wrinkle to kind of reception history and how we think about how songs and art work across time and people and places, and yeah.
Hi, Lisa. Congratulations. I'm really interested in whether there were any musical excerpts you used in these studies that didn't elicit converging daydreams or that didn't elicit any daydreams whatsoever. And as a music theorist, I'm really interested in, if that is the case, were there any general structural characteristics of the sonic makeup of those excerpts that would yield that circumstance?
Such a wonderful question. Absolutely. There are certain excerpts that are more narrative-y than other excerpts in a very stable, reliable way. But anything that we tried to kind of understand where that difference came from did not prove adequate. Like one thing we thought at first was if there's more contrast, like there's just more change in dynamics and register and anything, maybe that would correlate. But that wasn't really quite it. The only thing, we did another study where we used like all the features in the MIR toolbox. Shout out to my MIR toolbox users. That just like was like every acoustic feature you could possibly measure and like use that as a predictor. And those even aren't great, it's because it's just so dependent on how these patterns are embedded in these, really, really complicated ways that are hard to pull apart. So my suspicion is we have to look sort of at usage more rigorously. We're not going to get it from just like hacking away at the sounds quite directly in the way that we like to do.
Hi, Lisa. Congratulations. Back here.
Hello.
Hi. As a segue to that question, I was wondering if your study, this is fascinating, I was wondering if that study, the songs or the music that elicits more response to daydream, are they also more popular songs? Or, because I'm always curious on what makes a hit song, like what are the elements, right? So did you find that in your study?
Well, if I found that, I would like not be in this basement right now. I would be like on a yacht. But what we did find is that it seems to be a really enjoyable thing. Like to the degree that people tell us, so it's highly correlated with how much people tell us they like a certain song and how much they do this in response to it. And it's unclear whether it's just like when you like it, you listen more, and when you listen more, you do this, or whether it's that this is an inherently pleasurable, connecting thing to do or something, right? But there is this clear association between the people, and in all of the places that we've studied this is true, that the more people like the music, the more they do this to it.
We have time for one last question. I see a hand over here.
Thank you for your time. This is a really interesting conversation. I'm curious if you played with like medium at all, like, and just in sort of the context and people take it in, right? Whether it's like putting someone in headphones and listening to an MP3 or like a tape or a record or playing something live. I'm curious if you played with that and how that impacted people's memories.
That is an excellent question. I did have an undergrad at the University of Arkansas who tried to do that in a way, but didn't. I can't report to you some conclusive thing. It was a long time ago. But really, the only difference that we've looked at is over headphones or live at a concert. And as you mentioned, there's this whole range of other ways and contexts, and I think that's hugely interesting, and we haven't explored it at all.
Well, thank you. Thank you. Everyone, please join me in thanking Lisa and Tania.
Thank you very much. Thank you.